the role of innovation and partnership between a corporate organization and a startup company, like how they can be complementary to each other. So we talked a lot about already about the benefits of a startup working with a large corporation, but what are some of the benefits for a corporation working with startup? Is that we get insights into where technology is evolving, right? So specifically regards to AI, we're seeing this is a quickly evolving technology, and so we realize that because it's moving so fast, it doesn't make sense necessarily to build it ourselves. So we use an approach of buy, build, or partner. And so in some cases, it makes sense to just build the technology ourselves. In other cases, it makes sense to buy the technology, talent acquisition, or potentially for technology or capability that we're looking to enhance an existing product. But mostly why the 060 program exists is to partner with startup companies.
We've got a special episode today with German Aparicio Jr. He leads early innovation and startup partnerships at Trimble. From Cal Poly to Arup, Autodesk, AECOM, and Gary Technologies, German has lived at the intersection of design and technology and now helps startups scale through Trimble's 0 to 60 Accelerator. In our conversation, you'll learn why curiosity is a powerful career advantage, how startups can win over risk-averse firms, the truth about pricing and pilots when selling into architects and construction firms, and how accelerators like 0 to 60 give founders an edge. If you're an architect, engineer, or startup founder looking to push the future of buildings, German's insights are packed with practical takeaways. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I'm with a really special guest, German Aparicio Jr. He's the Program Manager of Early Innovation and Partner Development at Trimble. German, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me. Excited to join you today.
So before you studied architecture, before you became a lecturer, before you worked at one of the largest kind of software companies at geospatial and reality capture, you're at the intersection of architecture, construction, venture capital, startups. Before all of that, you fell in love with buildings somehow.
Correct.
Take us back. We have time. Why buildings in the first place?
Yeah, I think growing up as a kid was always just enjoyed the built environment. I was always one of those curious kids who would break things apart because I always wanted to understand how things function. So I was often getting in trouble for doing things like, I'll date myself here, opening up the back of a tube television, right, to just look at the inner components and how things worked. And so buildings always fascinated me in that way, and trying to understand how they function, how they're created, and was always kind of fell in love with the built environment and how to create and build these type of structures always fascinated me.
Well, from disassembling TVs to architecture school, something must have happened in there in between. But is it Cal Poly you ended up studying architecture?
Yeah, so I went from high school to Cal Poly, where actually started in the urban planning program. But at Cal Poly, the first year, all the disciplines in the environmental design school kind of take the similar courses. So I had the opportunity to take, the same courses as architects and focus more on urban planning that year. But I realized, architecture was the path that I wanted to focus on. And so, a lot of the ideas that I see today kind of stemmed from those earlier days, exploring various architects and thinking from art, specifically in computational design, thinking of like SolidWit drawings, procedural drawings, right? How to generate them, looking at cubists, artists, and how that translated to architecture or architects like Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid and others. And then how you kind of encode that into software tools was super interesting to me early in my career, and probably shaped a lot of my thinking early on, and why I decided to, from Cal Poly, go to work for firms like Arup, Autodesk, AECOM, and then eventually going back to grad school to get a degree in design and computation, to go from using tools to building my own tools, to then joining Gary Technologies before being acquired by Trimble.
So you were on the front lines of this like kind of broader wave of design computation. I guess you studied at a time when we were transitioning, I guess, from, what is it? I'm sure I'm going to miss a few movements here, but from postmodernism to I assume then the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, kind of the blobism turned parametricism. Is that kind of the shift that you were seeing?
Yeah. So in I guess undergrad, yes, early 2000s. And so at that time, tools like Revit were still hadn't hit the scene. So again, dating myself here, one of the first tools that we picked up was tool like SketchUp or 3ds Max, Form Z, right? Were
Mhm.
tools that
Mhm.
we used in undergrad for 3D modeling, and that always fascinated me. I even used AutoCAD, the 3D part of AutoCAD, to
Mhm.
generate building designs,
Mhm.
but that always interested me. And so trying to understand the differences between, which now I understand, differences between a mesh modeler versus a solids modeler, and more recently tools like Rhino that are NURBS based modeling tools. Understanding the differences and limitations and advantages of using these various platforms was something that I found interesting.
Right, right. And then I guess you know, in that transition, what did it look like moving from academia to now where you are in Trimble? So it's very squarely within software and in certain cases hardware. You decided to take an alternative path here. There's a segment of architecture students today facing that same kind of decision. Do I go into traditional practice or do I explore kind of maybe alternative ways? In your case, you decided to take the latter here. Do you regret it? And what have you learned from as a result?
No, not at all. I think it's a great question. I think I had the fortune of working at an architecture firm, traditional architecture firm, while I went to school. So I was a part-time intern at the same time that I was completing my studies. But I quickly learned that I was really excited and interested by the technology that was used to document and design these complex buildings, and was attracted to architects like Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid, Norman Foster, and others who were pushing the limits right in our industry. And so, just as a student, learning like Frank Gehry's use of technology and partnering with Dassault Systems to use aerospace automobile software such as CATIA to develop his buildings and gain control over the building design, which would allow him to design up to last minute, and also have control over the cost and schedule, right? To be able to build a building of that complexity at the same price of a standardized building, I found super interesting. So going from academia to practice, I kind of focused on that. And so I found myself, like I mentioned, working at places like Arup and AECOM, where we're building some of these complex projects, but these firms are still working very traditional, right? They're still doing things by hand, working in 2D, and some of these buildings are very challenging to resolve in 2D fashion, so required 3 dimensions. And so that kind of motivated me to go back to school and get a more technical background in design and computation, and pick up some programming language to be able to help build some of my own tools. And there it was where I spent some time thinking about knowledge capture and encoding some of the things that we do into software, right? So would take one of my favorite classes there was early on was focused on like looking at glass blowing, or using clay to like as a manual process to develop things. How you take those processes and encode them for a robot, for example, to create. Just kind of that thinking of knowledge capture, doing manual processes, encoding them to software for designers to leverage and automate, was super interesting to me. So that became kind of a path. And then my thesis really focused on leveraging reality capture technology to capture complex geometries in nature to design buildings. So that became kind of a thread that I carried over after grad school into opportunity that I got to teach in the Bay Area, and also work at Gary Technologies, working on Frank's projects and other projects for leading designers in our industry to both implement, which is now Trimble technology, and other technologies to help deliver those type of projects. So
Yeah.
that became super interesting to me.
Yeah. How do you reconcile, on the one hand, being on the bleeding edge of technology and even reconsidering how buildings are designed and built? How do you reconcile that with the, reality that in architecture and engineering, it's historically been a bit of a risk averse market. And these two kind of hold, are in tension a bit, right? Between just exploring new ways of even how to design versus actually selling that to risk averse firms. If from your perspective, you're now on the other side of the table. What have you seen? Are firms actually still slow to adopt, or has that in many ways become a cliche and that's not actually the case anymore?
I found in my career it's mostly cultural, so I think that's changing. I think yeah, a lot of the firms are open to adopting these new technologies. I think the risk aversion still exists. So I think a lot of these companies like to use pilots. So usually it's with early adopters. It's the innovation programs within firms
Right.
that adopt these technologies. So yeah, that's one way to approach it. Otherwise, it's a bottoms up approach. So a lot of it is just kind of employee driven, and we're seeing people like myself when I was at Arab who pushed this internally, become a champion and leverage just technologies to be able to deliver projects. So I think that's changing, and maybe that's just a generational shift that we're seeing.
As a startup founder myself selling into AEC, I appreciate that. I think that the go to market motions and like how do we actually even connect with these firms might look slightly different than say your traditional like B2B SaaS. In that, AEC does tend to be heavily project based. And like you mentioned, right, like there's a bit of a trust but verify motion where like you need to run a pilot first. There's often high stakes here in getting things wrong. Um, before kind of expanding into a second project and thus, supporting these firms. In your experience, what have startups done, or if there's examples of startups that I think have been exceptional in this way that really have kind of cracked this go to market motion, specifically in AEC?
Yeah, I think being project driven has been super helpful, right? So after joining Gary Technologies and being acquired by Trimble, during that time, I spent 10 years on the consulting side, implementing both Trimble and non-Trimble tech on building projects. And so it was then that I saw firsthand a lot of the challenges that our customers were facing. And so we're developing kind of bespoke solutions project by project, right? And why the Gary Technologies consulting was so successful was because there's a real need for this, right? Is to develop these bespoke tools really to make various software talk to each other, like transferring data from one platform to another and without the loss of information, right? Be able to have control similar to Frank Gehry's approach and leveraging CATIA of the design and then eventually delivering a set of construction documents, right, for construction. And
Right.
so it was through that experience that I developed a passion working for startups, working on consulting projects, developing bespoke tools that at the end of a project we'd just throw it away and then have to reinvent the wheel either on the next project or think of based on new technologies recreating it in a different way using a similar workflow but using the latest approach. I figured it's got to be a better way. Why not partner with startup companies? And that's what was the motivation for founding this startup program called 060, now Trimble 060, as part of those efforts to partner with startup companies to develop those technologies and bring them on to building projects as part of the consulting side, right? To be able to partner with them and create tools that would be useful on projects. A lot of the projects we worked on were these complex building projects where standardized tools didn't make sense. And so, in addition to pilots, that was like a perfect bed for startups to join a firm and show their value to these type of organizations. And so in parallel, I'm thinking of like SketchUp as a success, right? When they were a startup, and to your question on going to market and just pricing their product, like they priced it at a point where leader in a firm was able to just pay for it on their company card. Like it hit a threshold that it was cheap enough to use and implement on the project. And I think a lot of startups find success in doing that, joining pilots, pricing themselves at a point where they're able to use it on a project because a lot of the budgets in our industry, right, live within projects and it's easier
Right.
to offset the costs through a project than to your point, like the SaaS models through enterprise type of license.
Right. Right. I mean, tell me more here. Have there been examples that you've seen? I liked how the anecdote about like cheap enough to kind of put it on the credit card. I mean, something as is perhaps tactical as that. Um, what are other strategies that startups could take to better connect with, these firms? So you mentioned one of them is starting with pricing.
Yeah, pricing, partnerships,
Yeah.
just getting the word out. I think a lot of the success I'm seeing from companies is just educating, right? these type of large organizations. So
Right.
through our 060 program, we try to make introductions. So early on in the program, we started working with some small startups and trying to figure out like how we can best partner to help them grow and scale, make them successful. One of the things we found is making introductions to customers to our strategic clients was super helpful. That's something that startups need, is just like making an introduction, and a warm introduction for that matter, to be able to pilot and show confidence in their solutions. And so, in addition to, I guess, cold calling or getting a warm introduction from somebody in the industry, it helps to partner with an organization like ourselves to be able to walk in the front door, right, to some of these customers, but also finding customers that are culturally a good fit, right, that are open to innovation, to trying software that isn't fully worked out and providing feedback back to the startups. I think that's super important, to find those type of partners, and which we like to work closely with. I'm thinking of names like Hensel Phelps, right, who have innovation programs. I mean, a number of GC firms do, but
Right.
they're definitely open to testing new technologies, emerging technologies, and providing startups companies with feedback to help improve their products. So projects, yeah, are a great way to test these things, and partnering with large software companies like Trimble and others to reach out to some of these GCs and implement their technologies.
Yep. Today you're on the front lines of, early innovation and this 0 to 60 accelerator, which means you get to see some really incredibly cool companies serving some version of the kind of the building life cycle. Can you give me a flavor as to like what kinds of companies you're seeing, perhaps that are most exciting to you, and perhaps where they're focusing on? I appreciate when you double click into these, we could be talking about everything from like, project management to reality capture to BIM to, what are you kind of seeing? What's the landscape that's most exciting to you right now?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, maybe taking a step back, thinking about 2018 when we launched 060, is just to try to understand back then, there weren't very many startup programs or accelerator programs that were specific to AEC, right? If you wanted to join a program like that, most likely you went to Y Combinator, right? Which is like the best startup program that exists out there. But even with the Y Combinator, you wouldn't get, AEC specific subject matter experts as mentors or introductions into GCs or other potential customers, right, specific to our industries. 2018, I kind of wanted to take some of the experience from my time at MIT, and then from after MIT, spent some time in the Bay Area teaching at UC Berkeley and at CCA in San Francisco. Did some research at Autodesk. Take some of that and bring it down to what I thought was just going to be LA based interests, and work with startups in the LA area where I'm from. Quickly got interest around the world and started working with a number of startup companies, to your point, that were focused in different areas. So generative design, project management, 3D printing. There were kind of all over the board. And what we're trying to figure out is how to best serve these startup companies and help them grow and scale. As a large organization, what can we provide you with in terms of resources, mentorship, access to potentially funding opportunities, or just introduction to customers? And we found that one of the biggest needs for startup companies is those introductions to be able to scale. If you're a hardware company, the distribution that Trimble has is super interesting. Other than that, the mentorship, right? If you think about Trimble is a company of companies, right? I came to Trimble by way of acquisition. I mentioned Gary Technologies, became Trimble Consulting. And as part of that acquisition, Trimble acquired not only the consulting group, but also a technology that was then G Team, now Trimble Connect, which is our platform solution. And the entire company is made up of smaller companies, right? So Tekla, SketchUp, Trimble Connect, to name a few. So we have a number of the founders. They're still around and part of the company, right? So they come from that kind of startup mentality, and that's part of the culture at Trimble. And so how do we leverage that to work with these startup companies as part of a program? And so we ran with that. And last year we partnered with SketchUp on our business units to develop specifically SketchUp integrations. Think about SketchUp as a platform, right? They have their desktop solution, their web solution, their iPad solution. Like, how do we partner with startup companies to think about SketchUp as a platform to develop integration and then showcase them at our annual conference in November called Dimensions. And so based on the success of that program, right, we worked with 8 companies and brought them out to Las Vegas, or spent the summer with them creating integrations, and then brought them out to Las Vegas to showcase these integrations. Based on the success of that program, rerunning that this year, um, and this time scaling that up to work with both SketchUp, Tekla, Trimble Connect, and our project management solution called Project Site. And so how do we leverage those technologies, build integrations, focus on 3 categories? So connected design, connected construction, field or job site, to be able to build integrations on top of our rest of solutions to be able to scale some of these startup companies. So to answer your question, there's a long way to getting back to your question. The type of companies that we saw interest from were developing solutions in the areas that I previously mentioned. So project management, pre-construction, and those type of areas, building code requirements. But now we're seeing, right, in addition to that, startups leveraging AI. So AI is a big theme. So this year, we have a number of companies that are building AI solutions, either for like code checking. We have companies building agentic solutions that are working in construction, agents for the field. We have companies that are focused on reality capture that are developing tools, handheld tools, right, to leverage SLAM as a technology, for example, to automate the data or point cloud collection to drawings. A lot of interesting companies that are participating this year, and we're currently in the middle of our integration phase. So spending the last 12 weeks with them, developing their integrations on the previously mentioned software. Actually, our next milestone is coming up next week, and our 12-week check-in to see where they're at and prepare them for our annual conference Dimensions in November.
Tell me a little bit about, based off of your experience, what have you seen as the most common challenge for a startup? I know obviously startups could exist in different stages, from just an idea to pre-seed, seed, and having customers and traction. In these early stages, pre-seed and seed, what are some of the most common challenges you see founders and companies face in these kind of early incubation stages? You obviously alluded to a few, like helping with just getting them into the room and warm intros. But what are other challenges you've seen?
Yeah, so each startup is a little bit different. Some of them are something as simple as getting that product market fit, like they just haven't gotten there. So we have the ventures arm that really focus on Series A through D. These are more growth stage type companies. The 060 program really tries to focus on the earlier stage companies, that seed stage, early stage, even pre-seed stage companies who might have 1 or 2 founders, right? So a business, somebody with business acumen, somebody with a technical background, that are trying to find that product market fit. And so they're just looking for introductions to customers to be able to get the feedback and then grow from there, right? So some of the early stage companies have more of a need in achieving that product market fit, getting introductions to customers. Some of the later stage companies are interested in funding opportunities, right? Can we make introduction to some of our venture community? And so I mentioned the ventures arm that's focused on Series A through D. In addition to that, we're also a LP in a fund called Iron Springs. And so those are kind of opportunities. Plus we have a number of other venture funds that we work closely with. And so those are opportunities to make introductions for the startup companies that are looking for investments that might not be a good strategic fit for us. So one of the mandates for the ventures fund, right, in addition to fitting that kind of Series A through D, is to have a strategic fit with one of our business units, right? So we're looking for partners that we can build together with and grow together with. And so we have a number, the ventures arm has made a number of investments in AEC. Specifically, I'm thinking of companies like Document Crunch, who are focused using AI for contracts, right? And AECO, another company called Civ Robotics for layout. They're focused in AECO. Maybe more recent investments you might be familiar with, Project Mark doing a CRM. Another one, investment in a company called Outbuild, is focusing on scheduling. So yeah, those companies looking for investment, also strategic partner from a what we call a CVC, or corporate venture capitalist, right? We're not only looking for return on investment, but looking for to become a strategic partner, right? So we'll only take a small percentage in these companies relative to the other VCs, but it's really about that partnership and building things together. So that's maybe the second need that we're seeing from startup companies. And maybe the third biggest bucket is that go-to-market strategy, right? So for some of our hardware companies, right, that's something that Trimble is unique in that both a hardware and software company, more and more these days, software focused, but the origins of the company, right, didn't get into the origin stories of Trimble, but it got started by Charlie Trimble in hardware, embedding GPS technology into total stations that it's used for civil and other parts of the industry, but then evolved right into more and more software. So that's one of the unique value propositions of our organization, is that kind of connected field to job site. Yeah. Or job site to office, right? Between connecting hardware and software. So the needs that we're seeing from those companies that go to market strategy and being able to leverage Trimble's distribution and partner channels to help get their products out there.
You alluded to this earlier, but unpack for me, for those that might be listening, the difference between, say, corporate venture and I guess venture capital. I ask for the following reasons. I think as a former architectural designer, construction manager, that and then kind of getting in now into the startup world is kind of completely different in terms of the focus, the outcome. As I'm kind of going through and have raised a seed round, I appreciate that the expectations of a venture outcome is quite specific, that perhaps those that might be kind of just casually coming in as an architect who's looking to solve a problem, there's like a specific capital venture and with that outcomes that are expected. Can you unpack that for, say, an aspiring engineer, construction manager, architect who has an idea, they want to do a startup? Should they know before getting into the world of venture?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that it took me a minute to learn, and still learning, if I'm being honest. I've joined the ventures team 2 years ago and working closely with them now to as part of this 060 program, so understanding the value proposition that a CVC in this case offers to the startup community and its role among the entire kind of venture offering, right? So to your point, a startup doesn't have to take venture money, right? You don't have to be venture backed. Actually, probably preferable you don't, because you're giving up equity essentially when taking funds from a VC. So why take funds from a VC? I think ideally you would be able to be bootstrapped, so you'd be able to raise money from your customers, right? Your earlier customers are providing you feedback. You're developing the product together. They're also paying for that solution. I mean, that's kind of the ideal case. You're not, as a founder, not giving up equity, but you certainly reach a point where to be able to scale and grow, hire the necessary talent in the industry, attract that talent and grow your solution, that it makes sense to get some venture. So my learnings, right, you go from being bootstrapped or getting friends and family to finding angel investors, right? So these are people who may be founders themselves, who've exited their company, have some funding, and they're looking to support other founders in the industry. And so that's kind of the ways of getting that pre-seed, seed stage investments, right? Usually in the amount of like 100K, right? To usually fund like one or two founders half a year, a year. And then at some point it makes sense to start to raise from VCs, and traditional VCs will be early stage, seed stage companies. And there's definitely organizations out there that are focused on that. Some of them have their own accelerator programs, right, that you can go through. And at the end of that, usually there's some seed stage funding that take you through the next stage. Then eventually early stage investors that are really looking for that return on investment, right? So this is like, there's a handful of companies in our industry. Shout out to shops like Brick and Mortar, Building Ventures, blanking on a few others. But those, for example, have been funding a number of startup companies in our industry. Blackhorn Ventures, another one, right? More and more these days, Shadow Ventures funding a number of startup companies in our industry to get to that next stage, right? And for cutting checks and the amounts of 100K, 250, even $500,000, up to even $1 million in some of these AI investments, right? We're seeing crazy valuations these days to help get them to that next stage. And a lot of it is then ARR driven, right? So then you're looking at the growth pattern. So for somebody who's not familiar with this space, you're looking to grow over time. So typical timeline is like a year, 18 months, where you're going from one stage to the other. And in each round you're fundraising, like you're meeting VCs. And at some point it makes sense to meet with some corporate venture capitalists, where the goal there is to find a strategic partner, right? And to get to that next stage. So if you're looking for a Series A, this is why the Trimble Ventures um, fund kind of exists, for that Series A through D growth stage type funding, where the value that we provide is more in the form of a strategic partnership, right? Where we can provide startup companies with access to distribution or access to software. So building integration to Trimble Connect, for example, or access to mentorship, or, and funding. So Trimble Ventures doesn't lead any investments. That's why we work with other VCs it's just a risk, profile for the fund, working with startup companies, or sorry, other VCs to invest in startup companies. We co-invest. Before we jumped on this recording, we're talking about Hilti. We have a JV with Hilti. We often co-invest with Hilti. They're a great partner. But then, what we bring to the table is that strategic partnership, or hopefully we can make introductions to strategic customers or access to our technology, with the goal of growing and scaling together, right? So selfishly, from Trimble side, I'd be able to sell more Trimble products, or, help inform the direction of both our technologies.
For those considering applying to the 0 to 60 accelerator, what should they know? What are characteristics that you look for in companies that are interested in participating?
Yeah, great question. So mentioned last year was our inaugural year working with SketchUp at scale, right? So we're going to 8-9 companies this year. We ramped that up to 16 companies. And what we looked for in those two cohorts were that strategic fit. So thinking about the direction that we were headed in developing these products, and how these startup companies would complement some of that thinking, but also looking at the landscape of existing startups and where technology was developing, right? So one of the things we talked about before jumping on the recording was the role of innovation and partnership between a corporate organization and a startup company, and like how they can be complementary to each other. So we talked a lot about the benefits of a startup working with a large corporation, but what are some of the benefits for a corporation working with startup? Is that we get insights into where technology is evolving, right? So specifically regards to AI, we're seeing this is a quickly evolving technology, and so we realize that because it's moving so fast, it doesn't make sense necessarily to build it ourselves. So we use an approach of buy, build, or partner. And so in some cases, it makes sense to just build the technology ourselves. In other cases, it makes sense to buy the technology, talent acquisition, or potentially for technology or capability that we're looking to enhance an existing product. But mostly why the 060 program exists is to partner with startup companies, right, where we can complement each other. And because technology like AI is evolving, this partnership is super important, because we learn from each other, like the various approaches to incorporating AI into solutions, whether it's building a chatbot as an assistant integrated into the solution, or looking at automation workflows, right, with agentic systems, which is something that is super interesting for us today. And some of the companies we're working with as part of the 060 program are focused in that area. It's like, how do you create a user interface for our customers that where a lot of the source of truth, right, lives within our platform. So Trimble Connect, for example, hosts a number of drawing information or model information. And how do we leverage LLMs as part of agentic workflow to draw on that data and provide insights, and automate, in some cases, automate workflows, in other cases, provide insights, right, for our customers. So, generating reports, for example, that can be used for decision making, right, based on an intelligent systems. So we look at from the startups like where these capabilities exist and how we can partner together to create new existing capabilities within our own solutions. And like I said, the goal is to partner and grow together. So hopefully selling some of their products in parallel to some of our selling our own to our existing and new customers.
Yeah. Hilmang, this has been really fun. I think you've taken us on a journey from disassembling TVs to studying architecture in studio, Cal Poly and others, to working with one of the bleeding edge companies like Very Technologies, and now on the front lines of some of the coolest startups in the world. If you could give Helmang, say, straight out of college, some advice, now with the benefit of several years behind you, what would you tell Helmang now coming in to from school to practice, whether architectural firm or technology or whatever? What would you tell him?
Yeah, I think I would tell myself to stay curious. I think a lot of those things stem from just curiosity. What does a TV look like? Like in the inner workings of a TV, what does a building look like? What does it mean to build a startup company or learning ventures or writing your own code? These days, a lot of it is automated, but all driven by curiosity. So I would just encourage my younger self and I'm also a faculty member at Cal Poly Pomona, my alma mater. So I would encourage students as well who are listening to be curious, right? And use that to drive a lot of your decision making, because I think you end up in a great place.
For those students that do want to follow you, or say young entrepreneurs curious in following the Accelerator, how do they find you? How do they find the program?
Yeah, so you can visit us on trimble.com and check out our website. We have a challenge site linked to our annual conference called Dimensions, where we'll be hosting our demo day this year and showcasing a number of our startups participants in November. That's going to be November 10th in Las Vegas at the Venetian. So would welcome anybody interested to check that out. And I'm active on LinkedIn, so I would recommend reaching out on LinkedIn and following the various posts on the startup program and the various startup companies that we're working with.
Amazing. And Mang, thanks for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.